all this month and a half almost about function, okay, and inverse function. So again, this is just a review up here. So inverse function. So inverse function, when we have a one-to-one function, we actually switch the domain and the range. So this is a function. Here is the input, x. You end up with f of x. Okay, this is the inverse. This is a function. The inverse, when you switch them back, you go backward. So now my input is the y, and your x is the output. So again, let us talk about it here again. So for function, x is the input, y is the output. We call it y or f of x. Okay? If you switch it backward, like your y is the input, and your x is the output, so it will be a new function. We call it m of g or g of, they call it f of minus 1, which is the inverse function. So what happened actually? We're switching the domain and the range. The input is the domain, the output is the range. For the inverse function, the input, you switch the domain and the range. So now my range became a domain, became an input, and my domain became an output, which is the range. And again, this is not new because we've been working all about that. So here is a function. You have 1 and A, 2 and B, 3 and C. If you switch them, and instead of, this is the input here, 1, 2, 3, output ABC. If you switch them, the output here became an input. So ABC is the input now, and 1, 2, 3 is the output. So this is the inverse function, and we usually call it f minus 1. So again, all you do is just switch domain and range. You switch input and output. So it became an inverse. Okay, is this some example here? So this one here, if you can see my function f, my input is 0, 1, 3, 4. This is the domain. Output is f of x, which is -3, -1, 3, 5. Now, if you switch them, so my input now, this range became the input. So my x became -3, -1, 3, 5. And this input became an output, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. This became now f of minus 1. Okay? So this is very important to understand. How can I switch them in graph? Very easy. Just choose any point. -1, 1 and -1. And then you switch it. So it became -1 and 1. Okay? Choose another point here. 0 and -3. Switch it so it became -3 and 0. And then you connect them. Okay, and something interesting. The function and its inverse usually have a reflection over the line y equal x. So this is y equal x. So they should have a reflection because you're switching x and y, So they usually have a reflection over this line. Okay, how can I tell from equation? All you need to do is switch x and y, and you figure out the new equation. So I switch x and y, and you figure out the new equation. You solve for the new y. So here in this scenario, I switch x and y. So this became my f of minus 1, the new y, and this is the x. Now to solve for this, I need to add 3 and then divide by 2. So I can isolate this new y, which is the inverse function. Now, for the function to have an inverse function, it must be one-on-one function. What? Yes. What is one-on-one? One-on-one means every input should only has one output, and every output should only have one input. Means every x and y there are no repetition of x and no repetition of y. They're unique. And they have to pass the vertical line test and the horizontal line test. So let us look at this one. This one is one-to-one because every input and every output has a one value. There is no repetition at all. But this is not one-to-one. Why? Because I have this 3, even though it's an output, it has actually 2 input. Okay? So remember, this is a function because every input has one output. But the inverse is not a function. Because if you switch it back, I have 3, gonna have 2 output. This is why we call it not one-to-one function. The inverse is not a function. Okay? So now, How can I tell if it's 1-to-1? Every x and y should be unique. So x and every input should have one output, and every output should have only one input. So every input should only have one output, and every output should only have one input. How can I tell from graph? So this is a function, because if you make a vertical line test, it's gonna cross once. Now, if you go backward, I do the horizontal line test. So if you do the horizontal line test, if it crossed twice, is not a function, is not 1-to-1, I mean, because the inverse is not a function, But if you look at this one here, it's a function, because if you do vertical line test, is a function. Also, if you do the horizontal line test for the inverse, it's also cross once, so it's 1-to-1 function. So again, if you do the horizontal line test, it cross twice like this, so it's not going to be 1-to-1, because the inverse is not going to be a function. Okay, hopefully this help, and keep practicing.